Hi, my name is Catlin Tucker, and this webinar is titled Partner with Your Students and Achieve Balance with Blended Learning. So Balance with Blended Learning is the title of my new book, and much of what we're going to talk about in this webinar is grounded in that book. Many of the resources I mentioned are also available in that book. So I anchor the book in this idea of creating a true partnership with students. And I talk about the importance of kind of embracing partnership principles in our work with our students. So this idea of creating kind of that mutual respect and trust, working to actively develop that trust with our students to show that we respect them in our interactions with them, going through the process of setting goals, teaching students how to set goals for themselves, encouraging them to revisit and revise those goals, using goals to ground conversations like conferencing discussions about progress, really carving out time and making sure that in the design of our lessons, we're able to engage in open and honest communication with our students, and that we don't have classrooms where communication is a one-way flow from teacher to student, but it really is this reciprocal experience where students feel they can express themselves and share what's happening for them in their learning. Regular and timely feedback is such an important part of a partnership, so students feel really supported as they're working toward learning objectives. Balancing power in the dynamic between teacher and student by allowing student agency and that voice and choice, so they're able to make key decisions about their learning. And then really just being committed to learning together. And in this moment of so much change in education, I think it's so helpful to let kids know that in some ways we're learning right alongside them. Everything is kind of new in this post-COVID world. And so how do we embrace that continued learning, help students understand that we're also attempting to improve on our practice and learn as teachers right alongside them? So when I talk about blended learning, or I define blended learning as a coach or somebody working with teachers, I typically focus on this idea of active engaged learning online combined with active engaged learning in the classroom, offline, face-to-face. And there are a lot of different ways in which that active engaged online, active engaged offline learning are combined in classrooms and beyond. And really this kind of umbrella term that is blended learning, it encompasses a bunch of different models, a bunch of different ways to combine that online and offline learning. But ultimately, we're trying to give students control over four elements of their learning: time, place, pace, and path. Now, they're not going to control all of those things all of the time, but we want to give them some control over some of them some of the time, which is more control than they have in a typical classroom. So the different blended learning models give students different degrees of control over these four elements of their learning. And I think anytime we talk about balance in education or in our practice as teachers, we need to start with the design, the way in which we approach the design of our lessons and units. Because if we don't approach the design of learning experiences with balance in mind, we're not going to get balance at the back end of a lesson. So we have to kind of enter lesson planning with balance in mind, and then we're more likely to achieve balance, as we're working through lessons and units with students, or at the end of a lesson or unit with students. So often when I'm co-lesson planning with teachers, we really focus on balancing the online with the offline. So even though I am a big fan of technology, I like to see technology used strategically to engage students, I also am just as excited about offline learning. And so how are we balancing these two things in our lessons and in our units? Just kind of balancing the individual tasks with the collaborative tasks, the teacher talk with the student talk or the student voice, teacher feedback versus peer feedback. So how do we get feedback from more individuals than just us in a classroom? How do we get more eyes on student work? And then teacher assessment versus self-assessment. So if we try to think about these things in the design of our lessons and the design of our units, I think we're going to be set up to be successful when it comes to really achieving more balance in our practice. And a lot of teachers, when we work together, I highlight some of the main roles, responsibilities, jobs that we have as educators in a classroom. And I'll ask teachers to just consider quietly, like as I'm reading these off, who does these jobs, right? Who designs lessons, facilitates lessons, tracks and monitors student progress, provides timely, actionable feedback, attends meetings, communicates with parents, assesses student work. Most teachers are kind of nodding in the audience like, yeah, these are all our responsibilities. We do all of these things. And then if we start to put these responsibilities, these things that we do, into buckets of what happens from the 8 to 3 school day versus what kind of falls outside of that day, what follows us home, what invades our weekends and evenings, it becomes really clear why so many educators struggle with balance, right? We're designing lessons outside of our 8 to 4 school day. We do facilitate lessons during the school day. We may monitor informally student progress during the school day, but really tracking data and looking at trends over time typically happens outside of the school day. Providing timely, actionable feedback. I don't know that it's always timely, but the feedback we give tends to fall on our weekends and evenings. Attending meetings might fall within the school day. Communicating with parents rarely does. And assessing student work is something that most teachers do in isolation at home beyond the school day. So one of the questions I like to ask teachers to consider is your teaching practice sustainable? Is this something you can imagine yourself doing the way you're doing it in 5, 10, 20 years? And if the answer is no, or I don't know, then I think we really need to take a step back and think about how we're doing this really complicated job. Because I see this very traditional kind of like teacher led workflow in a lot of classrooms where I work with teachers and do some coaching. You know, teacher will assign some work, right? Give students an assignment. Everybody does the assignment, or ideally everybody does the assignment. Teacher collects stacks of literal or digital work. They often spend hours wading through those assignments, leaving comments, grading, entering those grades. They give the work back to students. Students might glance at a grade or a point value and then discard whatever this assignment is. And so if you think about it, one teacher to potentially 30 to 160 students, that's not a great equation mathematically. Every time you assign something, you might collect 30 to 160 work samples from students, and then teachers are left to kind of sift through that. And a lot of teachers worry, if I don't put points on that, if I don't grade it, kids won't do it. And so they end up with just massive amounts of work. And so I ask the question, who is doing the work in that scenario? In that scenario, the teacher is doing the work. The teacher is doing the heavy lifting, right? They're the one thinking critically about student work, thinking about what the work says about student-specific skill sets. In a classroom, my argument is the person doing the work is the person doing the learning. And so the person in that scenario who should be doing the work is the student, not the teacher. The teacher shouldn't be doing the lion's share of the work in the classroom. And so I encourage teachers to rethink workflows and reimagine different ways to have students, to kind of engage students in thinking critically about their own work, which I actually think can be more meaningful than the teacher slapping some comments and points onto an assignment. So in a teacher-led or a student-led workflow, you know, the student's going to complete the assignment. I taught English language arts for 16 years. And so before I ever saw an assignment, as soon as kids had access to things like Grammarly, you know, doing a grammar check, I was like, I don't want to see it. I want you to run it through Grammarly, do your own grammar check, try to correct as many of the grammatical and mechanical errors present as possible. I would provide, you know, an exemplar and maybe a simple rubric, or maybe it's a math class and you have an answer key or some problems that have been solved so kids can check their own work. But giving students time to look at the quality of their work and assess it against a key, an answer key, or against an exemplar and a rubric, and encourage them to think critically about their skills and what their work reveals about their skill set. And then ask them to do a reflection in a writing log or a learning log or a journal, or if they blog about their progress in school, really having them start to stretch those metacognitive muscles so that they're really thinking critically about their work and their progress. Now, in order to make this shift myself from teacher-led workflows to student-led workflows, I ended up kind of adopting this simple exercise. So I had the habit of asking the question, how can I, right? How can I get students writing more? How can I communicate more with parents? The problem with a question that begins, how can I, is that I, as the teacher, am the one who is going to be set up to do the work. The answer is going to put the work on me. Whereas if I stop, take a breath, and reframe and ask, how can my students, then the answer is going to have students leading whatever the answer is, right? Students communicating with their parents, students deciding how to integrate more writing into the curriculum, and really putting students at the center of the learning happening in classrooms. So I really think there's kind of 4 big shifts that teachers need to consider when it comes to creating more balance in their practice. The first is I think we need to teach students how to track, monitor, reflect on, and then communicate their progress with their parents. So I regularly want students stopping, looking at their work, considering what that work reveals about their skill sets, reflecting in a very kind of regular, dynamic way about that, and then knowing themselves and understanding their progress enough that they're able to communicate with their parents about their learning. The second shift is really pulling feedback into the classroom as much as possible so that it is actually timely and it's something students can act on. So ideally, feedback isn't something that happens at the end of a process. It's something that happens throughout the process so that a product will be stronger. Unfortunately, most feedback is given on a lot of these finished products where students aren't going to be acting on it. And often, teachers are giving so much feedback that it's not timely because it just takes a long time to give students feedback on, every aspect of the work that they've been doing. The third shift is making time to grade finished products with students, right? So that grades no longer have this kind of opacity about them, but grades are something students understand. Grades become a conversation. And then last is really that partnership and prioritizing student agency. How can we allow students more opportunities to have that choice and voice to make key decisions about their learning? So we'll start with this idea of metacognition and really proactively teaching students how to think about their learning in a very intentional way and in a very regular way. We want them to get comfortable thinking about their thinking about their learning. So one of the first things I encourage teachers to do is to make goal setting a regular part of their work with students, really encouraging students to set, track, and reflect on their goals because it can have a real positive impact on motivation, right? Like not every student is going to be intrinsically motivated in our particular class by our particular subject area. And so it becomes really important that students engage in a regular practice of identifying personal, academic, behavioral goals that they actually care about so that hopefully we can move them down this spectrum of motivation to the very least to get to kind of identified regulation where they see how their behavior aligns with their specific goals. So there are lots of different ways to get students setting goals. I think it's really important to provide a clear strategy for goal setting. As an educator, it's helpful to model goal setting for students so they can see us walking through the process. I would dedicate time to goal setting and not just setting goals, but also revisiting those goals and revising those goals in the classroom. I think when we carve out time in the classroom for specific activities, we communicate to students that these are things that we value and goal setting should be something we value. And then using those goals and the students' kind of goal setting sheets or whatever strategy they're using those goal setting sheets to kind of anchor those conversations we have about student progress. So if we conduct regular conferences with students, how are we using goal setting to kind of guide those conversations using the students' goals? So I share a couple of different strategies in my book, Balance with Blended Learning. One of them is this 3-part kind of visual goal setting map, where it kind of asks students, where am I going? How will I get there? And when will I know that I have arrived? So the idea is, where am I going? What personal, academic, behavioral goals do I want to set for myself? For each goal, what are specific behaviors and actions that I can do that are going to help me make progress toward that goal? That's how I'm going to get there. And then how will I know I've arrived, right? So what is accomplishing that particular goal going to look or feel like? Will there be external indicators that I have succeeded and reached this goal? Will there be internal indicators? So having students really kind of think through the process of goal setting. Then as we get, into our work with kids, finding, sustainable ways to get them reflecting on their learning. So that could be something as simple as an end of the week exit ticket, right? Where students are asked to identify what's one concept or skill you learned this week. How did you learn it? Describe the process by which you learned it for me. What questions do you have about your learning this week? Right? Which concepts or ideas are unclear? What goal do you have for your learning next week? And then this last question is my favorite. If you could design an activity to help a classmate learn the concept or skill you learned this week, what would you have them do? So building in time during our work with students to get them taking a step back and really thinking about, of all the stuff we've done this week, what is really landed for me? What have I really understood? What's making sense? What concept or skill do I feel like I have, made progress on this week? At the secondary level, I want this ongoing self-assessment to be really part of the work that kids are doing, where they're each week asked to think about the work that they've produced, choose a work sample, and then spend some time reflecting on what is that particular piece of work like. First, what standards or skills is it aligned to? And where do I think I am in terms of mastering specific standards or skills? So when it comes to ongoing self-assessment, I will typically pull target standards for students or with the teachers I'm coaching, and then allow students to spend some time collaborating with their peers to rewrite the standards in student-friendly language, because I have yet to read any standards that are written in student-friendly language. Then they select a piece of work from that week that they're going to think critically about and evaluate. Of the target standards for the unit we're in, which skill or standard do they feel like that particular work sample aligns to? And then they have to evaluate their level of mastery, right? So on a scale of 1 to 4, 1 beginning, 2 developing, 3 proficient, 4 mastery, where would they put themselves and why? I want to hear the why. I want to hear the justification. I want to hear their reasoning. Include documentation to the work sample. So if it's online work, you can have a link. If it's offline work, let's document by taking a picture. And then if you have questions, because we always build these in like a Google document, kids can tag the teacher with questions or requests for additional support. If students realize I'm not making a lot of progress on this, I feel like the last 2 times I've evaluated myself in relation to this standard, I've been at about a 2. And that's not where I want to be. I need additional help and support. Then it creates this avenue for students to ask for that help, ask for that support. So putting together kind of a simple document where teachers decide, okay, for this unit, here are the target standards. It might be 3, it might be 5. And then asking kids and carving out time. Again, we value, so we carve out time. Carve out time to engage in this reflective practice where you're thinking about what this work sample you've selected reveals about your skills and where you're at. And even at a young level, so when I'm coaching teachers in elementary school, really thinking about how to start this reflective practice and make it a little bit more young student friendly, right? So whether it's using emojis to kind of get them thinking about which emoji aligns with like how I'm feeling about this particular assignment or this particular skill. And why did I select that particular emoji? Can I write a sentence explaining my choice? So finding ways, even at a young age, to encourage students to engage in a kind of metacognitive practice, thinking critically about their work. That second shift was really around feedback and thinking about how do we make time for feedback in the classroom. And feedback to me is part of the teacher role as coach, right? We're coaching students as they work, helping them to develop specific skills. And so it's much better if we can pull that into the classroom and offer that support, offer that real-time feedback so that as kids are working, they're getting really focused, actionable feedback. So the problems that exist with traditional feedback is it's infrequent typically because it's so time consuming to give, right? When we do want to give feedback, we often like collect a bunch of literal or digital work, and then we spend days, sometimes a week, going through it, giving feedback. So it's often not timely. And the more time that elapses between when kids do work and when they receive feedback, the less effective that feedback is going to be, the less likely they're going to act on that feedback. Feedback often happens in isolation. So kids do work in isolation, we collect that work, we give feedback in isolation, we pass that work back, and they're left to process it in isolation. And there's very rarely an opportunity for a conversation about student progress. Often feedback is kind of relegated to finished products. And unfortunately, if it's finished, they're not going to do anything with that feedback, then it's a lot less useful. Feedback often focuses on minutia. There's so much feedback given on a piece. It's not really focused, and it can feel very overwhelming for students, and it's harder for them to act on. And feedback is often only one-sided, right? Feedback typically goes from teacher to student, not from student to teacher. And so finding ways to create feedback loops in a classroom where students can also provide feedback on what's working, what's not working, is really important. So early on in my work with the station rotation model, I realized I don't need to spend my teacher-led station always talking at kids, right? Providing direct instruction. Instructor is one of my jobs, but I'm also a facilitator, I'm coach, right? And so how am I making time in our work together to really provide that coaching for students so that I am supporting them as they're working? So I started pulling feedback into my teacher-led station. So if students were working on any kind of process assignment, so if it was a formal piece of writing, or if they were doing a lab report for their science class, or if they're doing a project, right? As they're working, I want to carve out time, create time to give them feedback on specific aspects of the work that they're doing. So that real-time feedback became my opportunity to like jump in and out of student documents, telling them like, this is really working, and you know what, this isn't, and here's a question, and check out this link to this video. It looks like you're missing this element. So it was a way for me to get into documents, give really specific feedback that then kids could act on as they're working, right? So I'm giving feedback on introduction paragraph while they're starting body paragraph number 1. And so they can easily go in and make the corrections I've suggested as they're continuing to work on this essay. Some teachers, so there's this, Mark Barnes wrote a book called Assessment 3.0 where he talks about narrative feedback. And so thinking about kind of shifting from this kind of opinion-based statements to more observations about what we're noticing in student works at work, and really highlighting, you know, what skills have been demonstrated in the work, where are the gaps in the work they're doing, what would benefit from further development, and then how can they, like, what should they focus on editing and revising before they resubmit. So really reinforcing this idea that skill development and learning, it's a process, and through the act of giving kind of narrative feedback as students are working, that then they're invited to act on to improve their work so they can resubmit, I think is a really powerful way to think about feedback. I also love John Hattie's 3 questions, right? Where he says, where am I going? And one of the things that I think about is how would I work this into my station rotation? So before real-time feedback, really making sure kids know here are the learning objectives. Here's the target learning goal or skill. And then this is what I think accomplishing that goal or kind of excelling at that particular skill is going to look like. So clearly identifying kind of in the form of a rubric what kids are working toward. And then that how am I going there? So during that real-time feedback session in a classroom, maybe as part of a station rotation, providing that really specific process feedback, encouraging kids to dig deeper, encouraging them to make connections, maybe try a different approach. Those are things that we can do in those real-time feedback sessions. And then based on the feedback kids get, having them ask the question, where to next? So directly following a real-time feedback station or feedback session, making sure students have time to, one, process the information that they've received or the feedback they've received, and decide, where is it that I as a learner want to go next? What do I want to focus on or try to achieve? And then during these real-time feedback sessions, what teachers will likely find is they have a much better sense of who's doing the work, who's falling behind. And so using that as an opportunity to encourage students to own the conversation about their progress. So if a student sits down at a real-time feedback station and they don't have the work they're supposed to have, how do we encourage them? Whether it's young learners who are leaving parents like an audio update about their progress, or whether it's older learners who can craft an email, but how can they keep parents in the loop about where they are in terms of their progress? And even at the high school level, students are not great with email. They think email is super formal. They struggle to construct like complete emails. And so giving them a template that they can use where they can think about how to articulate their learning for parents is really helpful. And so that can be, you know, articulating, I'm behind. I'm supposed to be here. I'm actually here. This is my plan for catching up. Or it can be a kind of a celebration of, here's where my growth is. This is what I've shown growth in the last 6 weeks, right? So allowing them to kind of share with parents when we're noticing some real improvement, some real growth, and encouraging students to share that with families. Rethinking assessment, I think, is an important part of this conversation around balance. I worry about the role that kind of traditional grading practices play in creating imbalance in education. So for me, I want grades to be demystified. I want grades to make sense to students, and I don't want grades to happen to students. I want students to feel like they have some agency around grades and the grading process. So when I work with teachers, I'll often reference this flow chart that kind of gets them taking a step back and thinking about, why am I grading what I'm grading? You know, because for me, if the purpose of work is practice or review, no feedback, no grade. And that doesn't mean nobody is thinking critically about that work, but it's not going to be the teacher necessarily. So if students are practicing and reviewing, that's the perfect opportunity, in my opinion, to give students an exemplar and a rubric or an answer key and ask them to look at their work, identify strengths and gaps and areas that need development, so they continue to learn and that they're developing and they're thinking critically about their work. If the purpose of work is work toward a product, then the focus is on feedback, not grades. So as kids are working toward a product, I want to prioritize giving them feedback that they can act on. And then last but not least, if the purpose of work is an assessment or a finished product, then students get a grade. Always use rubrics. I always use rubrics, and when I'm coaching teachers, encourage them to use rubrics to kind of make the grading process a little bit easier for students to understand. But they're not getting additional feedback on their work. They're not going to be comments written all over their work. So if students want to take a finished product, if they want to take an assessment and redo it or revamp it or improve and revise it, then I'm happy to give feedback. But I only want to give feedback, and I only want the teachers I coach to give feedback if students are going to do something with that feedback. So it's a really good use of our time, which is finite, right? Our time and energy is finite. So we want to make sure we maximize it. So I don't want to spend time putting comments all over something that students aren't going to then act on to improve. So I think if we take a step back and really question what we're grading and why we're grading it, and we're more intentional around what we grade, then we can create a little bit more balance. And instead of feeling so spread thin because we're trying to put grades on everything, because quite frankly, we're worried kids won't do it if we don't grade it, we can allow students the space to say, oh, I didn't really like that assessment score, or oh man, I know I can do better on this particular assignment. I would like to spend time reworking it and improving it. A lot of teachers are like, sorry, I can't grade it again. I barely got through the first round of grading. But I think that's because we're trying to grade too much. And so as we like design our lessons, so whether it's using a station rotation and instead of leading a station, having a teacher setup where we can pull one student from a station at a time to do a grade conversation or a side-by-side assessment, we can actually pull that process right into the classroom. Another model I love for creating this time and space to do side-by-side assessments is the playlist model, where students are working through kind of a series of learning activities in their playlist, and they have periodic check-ins with the teacher. And then at the end of the playlist, whatever that product is that students have been working on, the student comes to the teacher desk to do the side-by-side assessment. So whatever that product is, you grade it, the teacher grades it or assesses the skills with the student sitting right next to them, so that hopefully the student understands why they're getting the grades they're getting. And so the playlist model is great for really allowing students to control the pace at which they're learning, right? So there's a path, there's a series of learning activities students are going to work through. It's sequential, so they go in order, and the path can be differentiated. So often I will create kind of a middle of the road playlist, a next level playlist that's more academically rigorous, and then there's a more scaffolded version of the playlist, so that hopefully at least I'm differentiating from the start for 3 different groups of students. And the next level playlist might have a different product, and the more scaffolded playlist might have more teacher check-ins. So trying to find ways to meet different groups of learners who are in the same class kind of where they're at. So as they move through the playlist, they have on-demand instruction, there's offline tasks, there's online review and personalized practice, there's some formative assessments built into the playlist. And so as they move through it, students will hit these kind of yellow bars that say teacher time or Tucker time. That's their time with me, since this is one of my actual playlists, where they come and they sit with me and we look at their progress, and you'll see underneath the stop sign, it says personalized, focused, TBD, right? So personalized, focus, to be determined. So when I'm sitting with the student and we're looking at their work, we're going to decide what do they need to continue making progress. And we kind of co-construct that together. So we start with this differentiated playlist for 3 different levels, and then we do some personalization as the students are checking in with me about their particular progress. And even at the elementary level, playlists can be a really fun way to engage learners while giving them some agency, right? So in this playlist, which I co-created with a 3rd grade teacher, students are doing research around an animal of their choice. And the ultimate outcome is going to be a piece of writing and a multimedia Google slide deck to share out what they learned about their particular animal. So playlists are a fun way to kind of put students in the driver's seat in terms of controlling the pace, giving them some agency, while also creating some space for the teacher to work with students. So as we get into the side-by-side assessments, one of the things that I tell the teachers I coach is you don't have to grade everything. We don't have to grade every part of every assignment. Instead, my message is, if you try to grade everything, we're going to overwhelm kids. So instead, let's maybe choose 2 or 3 criteria, focus our grades on those 3 skills. And as we're entering them into the grade book, let's not dump a lump sum into the grade book. Let's be really clear. On claims, you got a 3 out of 4. On evidence, you got a 2 out of 4. On your explanation and analysis, you got a 1.5 out of 4. So that as students and families are looking at their progress online, checking their grades, it's really clear what skills they need to spend more time developing and improving. And ultimately, what I hope happens as students develop their metacognitive muscles, they think about their learning, they track and monitor it, they reflect on it, they communicate with parents, they engage in side-by-side assessments, is that hopefully they know enough about themselves as learners that they can then sit for a grade interview, right? So if they look at the grade book and they're like, man, I don't feel like this grade is a reflection of where I'm at right now as a learner. Because remember, grades are just a snapshot of skills at a particular moment in time. And so students might make progress beyond that snapshot that isn't reflected in their grade. So I want them to be able to look at the grade book and say, yeah, this feels like an accurate representation of where I am. I'm good. Or no, it doesn't. I have done work beyond these assessment scores that I think really show growth and development. And then I always made students, and I talk about this in the book, like build an argument, right? If you know you have 3 minutes to present, come up with a clear claim. Like, I think I deserve this grade because, and here are 3 reasons. Here are 3 things that I have done beyond the assessment scores in the grade book that I think show I deserve this particular grade. And as a teacher, when engaging in these grade interviews, you know, if I'm not convinced or I'm concerned about something, I might present a counterclaim. And if I present a counterclaim, then the student gets a chance to rebut. And so it's really about knowing themselves as learners in to such a degree that they're able to have a conversation like this. And these conversations are some of my favorite with kids, because they really do learn how to, 1, advocate for themselves, 2, talk about their learning in a really kind of cogent way, which is impressive. And if they ask for a grade and they don't get it, I think they understand why at the end of this conversation. And sometimes there have been so many moments in these conversations too, where as a teacher, I'm really blown away because kids have done something and I didn't realize how much additional work they had done. And I would have felt bad giving them a grade that was in the grade book. The last shift that I think is worth kind of talking about is this idea of student agency, and how do we give students more opportunities to make key decisions about their learning. So maybe we allow them to kind of decide what they're learning, right? So if we have a kind of an overarching theme, animals and habitats, Elizabethan England, maybe they get to choose the lens they look through, the animal they choose to focus on, the aspect of Elizabethan England that they want to learn about. So they're able to kind of decide, what do I want to focus on? What would make this really interesting for me? Maybe we build in opportunities to give them agency over the how, right? How do you want to get from here to this learning objective over here? What tools do you want to use? What path do you want to walk? What steps are you going to take? And allowing students some degree of agency over the process. And then the last one is really getting students to think about, why are we learning what we're learning? And what would I like to create to demonstrate my learning? What artifact would I like to produce to show that I learned? So giving some agency over how kids demonstrate their learning. And so I find that often that last one around demonstrating learning is one that teachers can really get excited about. And so in coaching sessions with a group of teachers, they wanted to create a project choice board that they could use really at the end of almost any unit to give students a degree of agency over how they demonstrated their learning. So they came up with 6 different project structures, and we built them out so that students could really decide, okay, we just spent this time engaged in learning in this unit. And maybe there was an idea that was really powerful or stood out to me, and I want to give a TED-style talk to demonstrate my learning. Or maybe I'm a really tactile learner and I want to build something. I want to physically construct something to demonstrate my learning. And so regardless of the project they chose, we had kind of these built-in supports on the back end so they could get started creating whatever this artifact of their learning was going to be. And all of them were really challenging, but the fact that students got to decide, they had a choice, all of a sudden they were much more willing and excited to kind of lean in, like, oh, I chose this and I'm going to do this, because they were the ones, you know, enjoying that choice and voice. So when I think about when I work with teachers and, you know, kind of ending with just some advice about how to continue moving forward, one of the things I really emphasize is let's use instructional models. Let's use these blended learning models, and let's use technology tools strategically to create time and space so that we can work directly with students, so that we can pull feedback back into the classroom, so we can conduct those side-by-side assessments. Let's really proactively teach students how to develop and stretch those metacognitive muscles, get them involved in goal setting, tracking and monitoring their progress, thinking critically about their work, prioritizing the process over the product, and doing that by giving students feedback as they work. I think giving ourselves permission not to grade everything is so important. We cannot use grades as carrots. Like, students have to start to understand the value of the work they're doing, which I think they're more likely to do if we engage them in this metacognitive skill building. Really prioritize student agency. If you do any research around motivation, and you'll very quickly see that the more autonomy, the more agency a student has, or a person has, quite frankly, the more likely they are to be engaged. And so even around grading systems, how can we give students agency? How can we have them looking at their grades and deciding, is this an accurate reflection of my grade? And if not, what opportunity do I have to make an argument for myself that this is actually the grade that I think I deserve? And so ultimately, I just want educators to see their students as true partners, and to believe that students are capable of being our partners in the classroom. So for any of the resources, the strategies, all of them I referenced in this session today are in this book, Balance with Blended Learning. So whether it is about metacognitive kind of skill building, whether it's about feedback, using rubrics as kind of roadmaps, all of that is in here, conducting side-by-side assessments, grade interviews. And of course, if you want to reach out to me and ask any questions about this session or the book, you can find me at Catlin_Tucker. I'm on Twitter, I'm super active, or you can post a question or a comment to my blog at catlintucker.com. So thank you guys for joining me today.